Do you subscribe then to the corruption of money being like upstream from so many of the other problems we have in American society? You know, it's not just economic, right? It's socioeconomic. People, there's the website, whatthefuckhappened1971.com,
Excellent.
you know, obesity, addiction, suicides, collapse of the nuclear family. It like goes through this whole gamut of data that's gone off the rails since 1971. I was just curious how much you subscribe to that.
In a way I do, right? So I think it was Kant who said that out of the crooked timber of humanity, nothing straight was ever made. And once you started leaning into fiat, a lot of problems will arise from that because, again, it's predicated upon trust into your idea of meta fraud. It becomes less trustworthy over time because these minor allowances become major problems very quickly. Right? Again, I've met several Fed governors. I don't individually think any person is conspiratorial and is doing this. I genuinely think they want what's best. But I would almost analogize it to, if you've ever seen Austin Powers, there's a scene where he's stuck in the corridor trying to reverse and push the car forward and backwards. Yeah. And I'm very almost sympathetic to the policymakers that find themselves in that position, right? Yeah. So to move overseas briefly before bringing it back, if you look at the UK, same sort of Anglo property rights regime. So it's an interesting counterpoint, right? They have the Bank of England, so they have an even more overt central bank. They have a problem that we don't, though, which is 1% GDP growth. Right. So we, as I've said before, hope is not a strategy. But listen, with AI, robotics, energy independence, the United States has a lot of really promising things going for it. I think the UK finds itself in a harder spot for a variety of reasons. And GDP growth is slowing. Post-Brexit, there's been some fiscal damage perhaps done. I think decisions that they made in the moment for very earnest reasons, but now they're struggling in some ways. But they have the same tools oftentimes that we have, right? Which is print money. Yeah. And so if things start to wobble globally, financially, which we've talked about hyper-dollarization or hyper-Bitcoinization, you know, there's a category of there's a category of countries I would call the wobble states, which are the places that are more likely to wobble faster, right? And so, yes, the U.S. might be in a fairly dire situation with tens of trillions of dollars of debt, but we have at least a few more levers we can pull on the work side that some of the peer economies don't, right? And maybe I should break that down. There's really three groups of economies that I'm somewhat worried about, right? The first are the sovereign debt addicts. So the U.S. potentially is one of these, right? Classic example is Argentina, right? Which is debt. Debt is a tricky thing. It's fun until it's not and the bill comes due, right? Those countries are going to hit debt overhang issues unless there's material changes in the way they run things. You know, obviously in Argentina, you've seen a policymaker focused on a form of anarcho-capitalism. It seems like he's made some promising efforts thus far. I mean, is it
anything's better than overt socialism, right?
Honestly, it's a low bar. There's a proverb in German which is "Don't praise the day until the evening." So I think we'll see what happens there. But thus far, I'm open-minded, right? So they're these debt addicts. Right. Then you've got what I would call the demographic time bombs. All right. These are countries like Italy, like Japan, where if you just look at the birth rate or you look at the demographic chart, it's not headed into a happy place for the economy and specifically for the social benefits that they're putting onto the workers to support everybody who is further up the chain here. They're also going to hit a problem with the way that they're running their currencies and their debt situations. And then the third and final group is what I would call the brittle autocracy. So these are countries, nation states, where they typically run off of some natural resource. But we live in a dollar-based world, the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar. And so these autocracies are pretty brittle because if the price of that currency moves in a way that is against their fiscal policy, they're really struggling with the dollar side of that equation, right? And so each of these three groups, right, the debt addicts, right, the demographic time bombs, and the brittle autocracies, each one of these could blow up in the next decade for very different reasons, but the result would be the same, which is a currency blowout and then a reckoning. And the options are going to be print a new currency, switch to the dollar or a stable dollar, maybe with the Genius Act, or Bitcoin, right? And that's
so no gold in the cards for you.
You know, it's gold. Gold's interesting. The idea that a country would go back to gold, I'm skeptical, and I think this has to do with what Ludwig von Mises calls the saleability of money or of currency. a good currency or a good way to change value has three traits, right? Which is it's scalable, and it's transmittable across time, and it's transmittable across distance. And what I mean by that is that if you truly go back to a gold or gold-backed economy, it is not very scalable, paying with doubloons or whatever. Obviously, you could use paper, but then you're right back to having...
You're right back. And
correct.
That's how we got in this situation.
Correct.
Yeah.
So unless you expect everyone to carry gold nuggets in their pockets, you're going to wind up with currency again, right?
Yeah.
It's just one of those things for thousands of years, right? Or coin clipping. And I mean, again, these are all problems that have happened before and would inevitably happen again.
Yeah.
The second is a currency needing to be transmittable across space, let's say space, right? And you need to be able to ship it, move it around easily. Gold, again, runs into this issue. There have been stories of currencies demanding their gold back, obviously from Fort Knox, things like that. It can be done. It is logistically very annoying. Gold is very heavy. It's not a super great way to transfer value, but again, it can be done. But I don't think it's competitive to Bitcoin in that.
It usually involves battleships.
Yeah, there's like a flotilla, or at least think of the Brinks armed guards, trucks, right? There's a reason why Starbucks doesn't have a couple of gold bars in the back, right? It just doesn't make any sense, right? And then the third is transmittable across time, and that's actually where Bitcoin has historically been the weakest because it's new. It's only been, if you're transmitting Bitcoin across time, it's only been a little over a decade. So this is not necessarily proven out in the case of the currency, right? A dollar bill in the 1970s spends just as well today as it did back then, even if it's worth significantly less.
Right.
Bitcoin, the hope and the belief is that your Satoshis are as good in 2045 as they are today, right? I do believe that if and really when Bitcoin overcomes that hurdle, people are going to open their eyes to it, which is why with these currency crises, I think Bitcoin is competitive on two and potentially all three of these categories.
Yeah, no, it's a great framing, and I actually think I consider Bitcoin to be the perfection of money, actually. And so through that lens, it's infinitely divisible and recombinable. So you can divide Bitcoin down into sats. You could go into microsats if that were ever necessary. So you get this salability across scales that's unrivaled, right? Like what, gold dust, gold atoms, it becomes pretty impractical at some point. Paper obviously has that advantage because you can just redenominate it however you want. And the paper's great across space where gold is weak, but the paper's terrible across time because you get the money printing issue where gold is strong because it can't be counterfeited. But then Bitcoin is beautifully both, right? It's digital but fixed supply. So it's, you can move it at the speed of light, but you can't debase it at all. So I agree with you. It's only a 15-year history. So remains to be seen if the salability of cross time will persist. But as long as Bitcoin exists, I think it will. And you could also argue, like over the first 15 years, well, Bitcoin's been the fastest growing asset in human history because of that fixed supply. So maybe the salability across time hasn't won all the hearts and minds of the world yet, but the first 15 years are off to a pretty good start considering its meteoric rise. So
I fully agree.
Yeah. And it's, I think that's actually probably one of the most useful framings for understanding money is Mises's salability. I don't know if it was Mises. It may have been someone else.
I know Sabo actually talked about that as well.
It's definitely in Saftein's book, and I think he got it from another economist whose name escapes me at the moment. But nonetheless, it's a really useful framework. I've heard you, I wanted to ask you this earlier. It's just reminding me of the question. You've used the word currency a few times. Like Bitcoin is what lets us turn energy into currency.
Sure.
Do you delineate between money and currency?
Interesting question. I don't in common parlance because there's a trap you can run into where you speak to terms that have technical meanings to an audience. And this is whether it's policymakers or bankers that doesn't. And so they get conflated. So I could be more precise in currency versus money and one versus the other. But I run into an issue with this the same way I often would run into an issue explaining that Bitcoin is the antidote to runaway M2.
Yes.
Like what's M2? Right. I think there's a joke where I said if you told every American that the thing they should be most afraid of is the M2 supply, they would ask you if that's a gang from El Salvador, right? So again, and I think that this is why as American Bitcoin, we need to be at the vanguard of education, right? And getting folks onto the Bitcoin standard the best that we can. But you do need to meet people where they're at. Yeah,
and that's proven to be quite tricky and really an idiosyncratic game that almost everyone has something to bring to the table that understands Bitcoin because there's so many people at so many different places, frankly. Does that ever present, because I know a lot of times when you start talking about the domain of currency, policymakers, bureaucrats, et cetera, really start to think, oh, that's their domain. Turf. So then if you say Bitcoin is how we turn energy into currency, they may feel threatened. How do you handle that if that's the case?
That's a great point. You know, I think folks are starting to come around to it a bit. I think the safest way would be to just solely talk about Bitcoin as a store of value. I think that is further reaffirmed by the fact that there are very few people admittedly transacting in Bitcoin. So we don't even necessarily need to fight that fight today. Obviously, there's innovations, Lightning Network, et cetera. So the ability to transact in Bitcoin is probably better than ever. But we can take it one battle at a time and as a store of value. I think threatening the sovereign economic powers of the state is a fight that you want to be very selective when you pick that fight. I'm certainly not of the opinion that we need to necessarily do that in the Bitcoin community. People ask often about my thoughts on stablecoins, right? Is this just the digital dollar? Is this a shit coin or something like that? Yeah, I don't take that hardline stance on it. I think getting people off of zero in cryptocurrency or in digital blockchain related monetary instruments or bearer bonds or whatever is a good step. I think that is a good step. I think that the more folks learn, the more they come to the Bitcoin standard. I admittedly came to Bitcoin comparatively late. I think 2015, 2016. I had been living in Indonesia, getting paid in rupiah. When I took the job, I wasn't really conversant in the rupiah to dollar exchange rate, but I realized that my livelihood was tied to that. And then I was trying to better understand who's determining that. And it was sort of a rat's nest of policymakers and bankers on both sides of the Pacific Ocean. And I realized that, wow, there may actually be something to this cryptocurrency situation, right? And I learned more about Ethereum and programmable money, but then I also learned again about the policy and the politics, both in cryptocurrency and outside of it, right? So I came to cryptocurrency thinking it would be bereft of politics. This would be a free space where the best currency win, yada yada. No, there's politics in everything. I think 4 people can't decide where to go to lunch without a little bit of politics, and I think a multi-trillion-dollar asset class is probably no different. But the nice thing about Bitcoin is it's rules, not rulers, right? Proof of work underscores the entire system. Miners are authenticating and securing the network. There's obviously the developers and the core community, but no one can unilaterally, not even Satoshi can unilaterally change, right? Yeah. And so I think having a rules-based system to tie it all together is what made America so successful. Yes. I think Bitcoin is a revamp of what a rules-based system for currency can look like.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a level playing field to make a game really prosperous and iterative over time, right? If you have the playing field changing all the time, well, then people can't really adapt a sound strategy or play any game persistently.